Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today we are in game 3 of our coverage of the 2021 World Chess Championships between the defending champion Magnus Carlsen and the challenger Jan Nepo. Now, the first two games were both draws, but they were exciting. You could tell both players are trying some pretty creative things. They're definitely going for some variations that are not easy at all to play, and so we'll see. This is a best of 14 series. Does not look like these players just want to play 14 straight draws, although we do have 2 draws so far. So we'll see if that changes today and see if any of the tactics that these players had in the first 2 days will actually change today. So white's going to be played by Nepo today. Magnus Carlsen defending with the black pieces. Starts out very similar to how we saw game 1 when Jan was playing the white pieces. Starts out e4, e5, Nf3 Nc6, bishop b5, getting into the Rye Lopez. And similar to game 1, we see a6, bishop coming back here to a4, knight 2 f6, and similar moves all the way until we get to move number 8. So these all should look very familiar if you've been following our coverage. And so usually you start to look at the martial lines, just looking at the c3, preparing to push forward with d4. And then you have the anti-martial lines, and that's exactly what Nepo was going for. In game number 1, he played pawn to h3. In this game, he decides to go for a4. Magnus Carlsen responds with bishop here to b7, pawn to d3, d6, knight to d2, preparing to come down here to f1 and then eventually come up to e3. It's sort of awkward if the knight comes to c3. Really want to have this pawn being able to push forward up here to c4 in the variation. So knight coming here to d2, then f1 position here to e3. Allows it to come to these great outposts here on f5 and d5. So that's what Jan is thinking about right now. And then Magnus Carlsen plays rook to e8. Now this is a move that many moons ago, 100 plus years ago, this was pretty common. Not so much anymore. We typically don't see this. Nowadays, you're looking at things like knight to d7, just trying to position this knight over to the queen side of the board. Maybe now knight to f1, as we talked about, and then knight to c5, attacking this bishop right here, centralizing this knight with an outpost. They asked Magnus Carlsen about this rook here to e8, and he said, yes, this was only the 10th move, but this was an awful move by him. I think that's kind of a stretch. I don't know this necessarily was awful, but he did not think very highly of this rook to e8. Nepo now positions his knight here on f1, preparing to bring it to e3 as we talked about. h6 just blocking off the g5 square so the knight can't come here to g5. So this knight on f3, it's going to be hanging out, not doing anything too much. Bishop here to d2. Bishop coming back here to f8, just opening up for the rook to control this e-file. Knight to e3. Knight over here to e7 and then c4. So immediately once this knight moves away from controlling this center of the board, Jan decides to go ahead and attack immediately on the queen side with pawn up here to c4. We do see the pawn take, knight take here on c4. Knight c6, rook here to c1, just attacking this semi-open file here. You always want to put your rooks on semi-open files, meaning just one pawn is gone, or an open file. If there's no pawns at all, rooks do really well in that position, just because they can control so much more of the board than just defending right behind one pawn or piece. Pawn comes down here to a5 from Magnus Carlsen. This is somewhat of a tough spot, I think. This knight here on c4 and the bishop on d2 are both attacking it. Yes, right now Magnus does have both the knight here on c6 and the rook here on a8, both defending this pawn, but he's really just setting himself up to have multiple pieces trying to defend this pawn here on a5. Bishop to c3. Bishop comes back here to c8. Pawn to d4. We do see the exchange in the center of the board. Knight takes on d4, and then the knight exchanges here on d4. Definitely better, I think, than if you want to try something else. Bishop to b7. If you don't want to take here, it gets pretty tricky because then all of a sudden knight takes here on c6, bishop takes here, but then they could play f3, so defending this pawn right here. But now that knight was defending this pawn here on a5, and now white has both the bishop and the knight attacking this. It's going to be very difficult for black to hold on to this pawn, and so they're not. So maybe something like bishop to d7, and then the knight takes here on a5. White would go up a pawn in material. So think about this specific position, because in the game, we see Magnus take here on d4, and then the queen takes, and then bishop here to e6. You may say, okay, well, now that that knight's gone, can't white actually just take this pawn here on a5? And if you look at it, it's different, because the bishop here on e6, what Magnus Carlsen is thinking this entire time is this is actually defending this pawn here on a5. And so you have to kind of think about chess at a Magnus Carlsen type level, because you have to think about, if this knight moves, what is it leaving behind? Well, it's leaving this bishop here on b3 behind. So if you see the knight take here on a5, then c5, forcing the queen to come back. Queen comes back here to d2, and then the bishop takes here on b3. So yeah, they could play, knight takes here, but then the knight takes here on e4, and now black goes up a good bit as far as development here. They can easily look to attack this pawn here on a4. Both sides equal in material, but it's going to be very easy, I think, for black in this position to get the upper hand. This knight is attacking this queen right now, going to be looking to take this pawn on the next move. So all in all, definitely not the position that white would want to be in. And so that's exactly why you see after bishop here to e6, we don't see Nepo taking the pawn here on a5. Instead, we see pawn to h3, something that he played very early on in game one, decides to go ahead and play it now, keeping the knights at bay so it doesn't come over here to g4. Just a nice little move. Also allows the king at some point to come to h2. Doesn't have to worry about any shenanigans on this first rank here, any sort of back rank mate, anything like that. Now pawn to c6. Usually don't just want to push up here with c5. You want to have some flexibility. Potentially now you could play d5. If you just commit already with pawn to c5, then all of a sudden you have to worry about this backward pawn here on d6 that you're going to have to defend the rest of the game here. So c6, this also opens up for the queen on d8 to now defend this pawn here on a5. So it's doing double duty. Anytime these players are moving a piece, they're always thinking about multiple threats and multiple ways they can defend with every single move. That's exactly what Magnus Carlsen is doing with that c6 move. Now bishop comes back to c2, putting another defender on this e4 square. Pawn to d5, so does decide to go ahead and attack on this d5 central light square here. Pawn pushes forward to e5, attacking the knight. We do see an exchange with the pawn taking the knight. Queen takes here up on d8, and then the pawn takes the knight here, and you can see just a flurry of pieces coming off the board here. And at the end of it all, you can see Magnus Carlsen, I think, gets the worst of it. He has double pawns here on the c-file. Going into the endgame, not exactly what he wants. The bishops are on the same color, so it's going to be very difficult for either of them to get the advantage with just the bishops. And then you can start to see from the rook coming over here to b8, and then rook to b1. Almost kind of seems like they're looking to get into a endgame, a drawn game, just because they are just moving the pieces off the board here. So after the rooks came off, I definitely knew this was going to be a quick game after this. Now we're on move 32 right now, but it's very difficult, even though Magnus Carlsen has the worst pawn structure, for Nepo to really do anything. And I would almost say this is an even position. I'd say white has a better position in general, but he's playing Magnus Carlsen, and so even though Magnus Carlsen has a double pawn here on the c-file, he is Magnus. So all in all, I'd say this is pretty even if you take into account the players that are playing the positions. So Magnus doing a good job of centralizing his king here. Now we see Nepo doing the same thing. King to e2, pawn f5, bishop here to c2, defending the pawn over here on a4. Bishop comes back here. Again, not real threat for any side here. Bishop to c2, just moving back and forth here. Bishop to d7, attacking the pawn, but the bishop on c2 is going to do a good job of defending that. Pawn to f3. King comes back here to f6. And the way these pawn structures are set up, there's no real way for either of the kings to even push through as well. If pawns are on the c and the f file, you can see that blockades all of the squares of going towards the other side. Same both for white and for black. And you can see with just the b file as well as the g file, it's very difficult for either side as well. Pawn here to h4 blocks off one of the potential squares that the king can come here to g5. So Magnus Carlsen just plays king to e5, king to f2, recognizing the only way potentially to get anywhere is on the king side, but this pawn here on f4, and it's also on a dark square, so the light square bishop can't do anything about it, is going to prove very, very difficult for Jan to do anything about it. So a few moves later, they have twofold repetition and then decide, hey, this is going to be a draw game. And so they stopped after move 41. So this is game number 3. We have 3 draws in a row. I felt like the first 2 were a little bit more dynamic. I was surprised that Jan decided to play the same Rai Lopez anti-Marshall. I know he played a4 instead of h3 on the 8th move, but I didn't feel like he had a strong advantage in game 1, and my takeaway from him playing the same opening is he saw a weakness in Magnus Carlsen. I thought Magnus was completely prepared for that opening. But all in all, it is what it is. So we will have a rest day tomorrow. Remember, they have 3 days on, take a rest day, come back for 2 days, take a rest day, and they repeat that same process. So another 3 days from there, take it off, and then 2 days. So we will take a break tomorrow, and then we will be back for 2 days after that. So thank you guys so much for watching. 3 draws. We'll see if we can get some wins on the board after the rest day. But thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.